This old photo went unnoticed for 100 years, until someone zoomed in. The photograph arrived at the Chicago History Museum in March 2024, part of a large donation from the estate of a former journalist who had spent decades collecting images of Black Chicago, Dr. Marcus Thompson, a curator who specialized in African American history and the Great Migration, sorted through hundreds of images. There were church gatherings, street scenes, and family portraits. Each one was a precious piece of lives that had been left out of regular history books. This particular photograph was dated February 17, 1919, and showed a crowd gathered on South State Street in Chicago's Black Belt. This was the busy neighborhood where hundreds of thousands of Black Americans had moved, looking for jobs and freedom from Southern oppression. The image captured a moment of celebration. Black soldiers in their military uniforms had returned from the Great War in Europe. They were surrounded by community members, men in suits and hats, women in their finest dresses, and children perched on shoulders to see the heroes who had served their country. The photograph had been published in the Chicago Defender, the important Black newspaper, in February 1919. Marcus had seen similar images before. These were homecoming celebrations for the thousands of Black soldiers who had fought in France. They had experienced some respect abroad that their own country denied them at home. These men had returned with new hopes. They had shown their courage and love for their country. They believed their service would earn them the rights they had been denied. Marcus scanned the image into the museum's high-resolution digital archive system. This process would preserve it and make it easy for researchers to see. As the scan finished, he looked at it on his computer screen and noted details for the catalog entry. About 50 people were visible. The State Street storefronts were in the background. It was midwinter based on the heavy coats and scarves. Then, following normal steps, he zoomed in to check details that might help identify specific people or give more historical context. He moved across the faces, noting expressions of pride and joy. He examined the soldiers' uniforms for unit signs and checked storefronts for business names that might confirm the location. He zoomed toward the back of the crowd, where the image became grainier. Still, it showed people standing in doorways and on steps, watching the celebration. And there, in the shadow of a doorway, barely visible in the darkness, was a woman. Marcus increased the magnification and adjusted brightness and contrast. The woman was thin and dressed in a dark coat and hat that helped her blend into the shadows. Her face was turned slightly away from the camera, as if she did not want to be photographed. But her hands were visible, and she was holding something. Marcus felt his heart beat faster. He improved the image further, using the museum's advanced restoration software to bring out details that would have been invisible to anyone looking at the original print. The woman was holding a sign, a piece of cardboard or wood, roughly 2 feet by 3 feet. And on that sign, in hand-painted letters, now barely readable even with enhancement, were words that made Marcus catch his breath. They served. They returned. They were murdered. Below the main text, smaller words listed names and places: Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee. Marcus sat back from his screen, his mind racing. This photograph, published in a Black newspaper in February 1919, had captured in its edges someone recording what the celebration could not admit. Black veterans returning from war were being lynched in the South. They were killed for wearing their uniforms and for claiming the dignity they had earned. And this woman, hiding in the shadows, had been there to bear witness. Marcus spent the next several days deep in research, rebuilding the context of that February 1919 photograph. The Great War had ended in November 1918, and by early 1919, Black soldiers were coming home to a country that had changed and yet stayed brutally the same. Over 350,000 Black men had served in the war. Thousands had fought in combat units despite military separation and racist ideas about their abilities. In France, these soldiers had been treated with respect many had never known in America. They had fought alongside French troops and been welcomed in French communities. They had lived without constant fear and shame. Now they were returning to a country where white supremacy was violently pushing back. White people felt threatened by Black veterans who no longer accepted second-class citizenship without question. Marcus pulled up research on what historians called the Red Summer of 1919. This was a wave of white supremacist violence that swept across America in the months after the Elder with Ware ended. Race riots broke out in many cities. In the South, black veterans were targeted. They were lynched for wearing their uniforms, for not showing enough deference, or for the crime of proving their equality through military service. The violence was recorded but rarely punished. White mobs attacked freely, while law enforcement looked away or joined in. Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender tried to report these terrible acts, but mainstream white press mostly ignored them or blamed black communities for the violence against them. Marcus found records of specific cases from early 1919, around the time of the photograph. In Georgia, a soldier named William had been lynched 2 weeks after returning home. He was killed for refusing to step off a sidewalk when a white man came near. In Alabama, 2 veterans had been dragged from a train and murdered for wearing their uniforms. In Mississippi, a soldier had been beaten to death for trying to vote. His uniform was torn from his body and burned. The homecoming celebration captured in the photograph showed one side of the black veteran: experience, community pride, recognition, and hope. But the woman with the sign represented the other side: the terror, the murders, and the true systemic violence waiting for these men if they returned to the South, or even if they claimed their rights in the North. Marcus enlarged the photograph again and studied the woman's posture. She stood apart from the celebration, in shadow, almost invisible. Her sign was positioned so that most of the crowd would not see it, but the camera had captured it. Had she known? Had she placed herself there on purpose, so that this evidence would be saved? He examined the soldiers' faces again, their expressions of pride and determination. Did they know what waited for so many of their brothers? Did the celebrating crowd know, even as they welcomed these heroes home, that dozens of black veterans had already been murdered? The photograph suddenly felt less like a simple celebration and more like a record of deep complexity. Joy and terror existed at the same time. Hope was shadowed by harsh reality. A community was honoring its heroes while knowing that heroism would not protect them from white supremacist violence. Marcus needed to know more about the woman in the shadows. Who was she? Why had she brought that sign? What happened to her afterward? Marcus reached out to Dr. Evelyn Crawford, a historian at Northwestern University. She specialized in black activism and resistance during the early 20th century. They had worked together before, on exhibitions about the Great Migration and the growth of Black Chicago's political and cultural groups. When Evelyn saw the enhanced image of the woman with the sign, her response was quick. I need to see the original photograph, and I need access to Chicago Defender archives from 1919. They met at the museum 2 days later. Marcus had prepared a detailed file with the original photograph, the enhanced versions showing the woman and her sign, historical context about black veterans and racial violence in 1919, and early research on the homecoming celebration itself. Evelyn studied the images carefully, using a magnifying glass on the highest resolution prints. The sign is hand-painted, probably made shortly before this photograph, she observed. The lettering is careful and deliberate. This was not a quick protest. But why stand in the shadows? Marcus asked. If she wanted to protest, why hide? She was not hiding, Evelyn corrected. She was documenting. Look at her position. She is far enough from the celebration not to disturb it, but placed where the camera could capture her. She wanted this recorded. Marcus pulled up the published version of the photograph from the February 19, 1919 edition of the Chicago Defender. The printed image was darker. The woman in the doorway was completely invisible. The newspaper could not see her in the print, he noted. Or chose not to see her, Evelyn suggested. The Defender was reporting on lynchings, but they were also trying to keep community spirits high and celebrate successes. A protest sign in the middle of a homecoming celebration might have been too complicated and too painful. They searched through other Defender issues from early 1919, looking for any mention of protests or demonstrations related to veteran lynchings. The paper ran regular reports on violence against black people, including specific articles about murdered veterans. But there was nothing about anyone protesting at this particular homecoming event. She may have been acting alone, Evelyn said, or as part of a small group that the mainstream press, even the black press, did not acknowledge. Marcus found something in a March 1919 issue, a small notice about a committee for veteran justice that was collecting information about attacks on black soldiers. The notice asked readers to send details to a post office box in Chicago's South Side. That could be connected, Evelyn said. Someone was carefully gathering evidence. Let me check archives at the Newberry Library. They have collections of black activist organization records from this period. Over the next week, Evelyn traced references to anti-lynching activism in Chicago during 1919. The city had several organizations working on these issues, including the NAACP chapter, church-based groups, and women's clubs. But specific information about a committee for veteran justice was harder to find. There were no official papers, no meeting notes, and no membership lists in the usual archives. Then Evelyn found something in an unexpected place: police surveillance records. In 1919, Chicago police, like law enforcement across the country, watched black activist organizations. They saw them as possibly radical or dangerous, especially those that challenged racial violence. A report from March 1919 mentioned briefly a Negro woman distributing pamphlets about soldier lynchings and warned to stop her activities. No name was given, but the date and description matched the time frame of the photograph. Marcus and Evelyn expanded their search. Now they looked for any references to black women activists in Chicago in early 1919, who focused on violence against veterans. The challenge was huge. Women's activism was often not well recorded compared to men's, and black women's work was even more often erased from historical records. Evelyn contacted colleagues across the country, historians who specialized in black women's activism, in anti-lynching movements, and in the complex politics of the Great Migration period. She shared the photograph, the enhanced images, and the pieces of information they had gathered. Dr. Angela Harris, a historian at Howard University, responded within days. "I think I know who she might be," Angela wrote. "There was a woman named Ida, not Ida B. Wells, but someone who worked in similar ways. She is barely mentioned in records, but I have seen her name a few times in connection with documentation of lynchings. Let me search my files." 3 days later, Angela sent a detailed email. She had found references in church records from Olivet Baptist Church, one of Chicago's largest black congregations. The church had hosted meetings about racial violence, and minutes from a February 1919 gathering mentioned Sister Ida presenting evidence of atrocities against our soldiers in the South. No last name was recorded, but there was a note. Sister Ida continues her dangerous work of documentation despite warnings. Marcus felt a surge of recognition that matched the police surveillance report. She was warned to stop her activities. Evelyn found more pieces. A letter from March 1919, preserved in the personal papers of a Defender editor, referenced the woman who had been documenting every soldier lynching. "She's going to get herself killed if she keeps this up." Still no full name, but the references were building a picture. A woman acting as a one-person documentation project, gathering evidence of murders, presenting it to churches and community organizations, refusing to stop despite danger. Then Marcus found the breakthrough. In the Defender archives, he discovered a letter to the editor from April 1919 that was never published. The letter was signed Ida Freeman, and it read, "I write to correct your report of March 23rd regarding the murder of Corporal James in Georgia. You state he was killed in an altercation. This is false. I have testimony from 3 witnesses that Corporal James was dragged from his home by a white charge and lynched for refusing to call a white boy sir. His uniform was torn from his body. His mother kept the bloody jacket. I have seen it. I have photographed it. We must stop using gentle language for murder. We must document these crimes precisely, or history will forget them." The letter was strong and clear. It provided a full name, Ida Freeman. Marcus searched census records. In the 1920 Chicago census, he found an Ida Freeman, age 28, listed as a lodger in a South Side boarding house. Her occupation was listed as domestic worker. She was born in Mississippi and had moved to Chicago around 1917. But there was no Ida Freeman in the 1930 census. She had disappeared from records. She either left Chicago, married, and changed her name, or died. Evelyn said, "Given the context, the warnings, and the dangerous work she was doing, we need to consider the possibility that something happened to her." Marcus pulled up death records for Chicago from 1919 to 1925. The records were incomplete, especially for black residents, whose deaths were often less carefully noted than white residents. But after hours of searching, he found an entry from August 1919. Ida Freeman, Negro female, age approximately 27, found deceased in an alley near 35th Street. Cause of death, undetermined. No investigation pursued. The brief death record sent chills through Marcus. Found deceased in alley. Cause undetermined. No investigation pursued. For a black woman in 1919 Chicago, especially one doing work that challenged white supremacy, this was a death that authorities had chosen not to examine. Marcus and Evelyn knew they needed more information about Ida's death and her life. Angela Harris traveled from Washington, D.C. to join the investigation, and together the three historians began piecing together Ida's story from fragments scattered across archives. They found Ida in the 1910 Mississippi census, living in a small town near Jackson. She was 18 years old, living with her parents, who worked as sharecroppers. By 1917, she had migrated to Chicago, one of hundreds of thousands of black Southerners seeking escape from Jim Crow violence and economic hardship. Church records from Olivet Baptist showed Ida becoming a member in 1917. She attended regularly, participated in the Women's Auxiliary, and by 1918 was noted as someone who assists families in distress. Then, in late 1918 and early 1919, references to Ida's work became more specific and more troubling. A letter from a church elder to the pastor, dated January 1919, expressed concern. Sister Ida's work documenting Southern atrocities is important, but increasingly dangerous. She receives threatening letters. Some in the congregation fear her presence draws unwanted attention from authorities and from white supremacist groups who have threatened northern black communities. Marcus found copies of some of those threatening letters preserved in police files. They were vicious and racist, promising violence if she did not stop spreading lies about the South. But Ida had continued. In February 1919, she had stood in that doorway during the homecoming celebration, holding her sign, making sure that someone, the photographer or history, would record that even in this moment of joy, black veterans were being murdered. They discovered that Ida had been compiling a detailed record of veteran lynchings, names, dates, locations, circumstances, and witnesses when possible. She had been traveling carefully and at great personal risk, interviewing families of murdered soldiers, collecting evidence, and taking photographs when she could obtain them. One family, reached through descendants living in Chicago, still had letters Ida had sent them. Mrs. Dorothy, age 87, showed the historians a letter from March 1919. Dear Mrs. Williams, I'm writing to extend my deepest sorrow for the loss of your son, Corporal Thomas Williams, murdered in Alabama on February 12, 1919. I'm documenting these crimes against our soldiers so that history cannot deny them. Would you be willing to share your son's story? I promise to honor his memory and ensure his sacrifice is remembered. With sympathy and solidarity, Ida Freeman. The letter was careful and respectful, but also determined. Ida had been building a complete record, understanding that without documentation, these murders would be forgotten or dismissed. She was doing the work that should have been done by the government, Angela observed, systematically recording racial terrorism and creating evidence that could not be denied. But someone had wanted that work stopped. The threatening letters made that clear. And Ida's death in August 1919, just 6 months after the photograph and just months after her soul's most intensive documentation work, suggested that those threats had been carried out. Marcus found one more crucial piece, a police report from late July 1919, weeks before Ida's death, noting that she had reported being followed by white men who threatened her. The officer's note was dismissive, claims harassment, advised to avoid causing trouble. The three historians realized that if Ida had been systematically documenting veteran lynchings, she must have created an archive of photographs, testimonies, and records. But where was it? Nothing like that had been found after her death, and it was not in any known collection. Evelyn started with Olivet Baptist Church, searching through their storage for any boxes or files that might date to 1919. Churches had often served as safe places for important community documents. After 2 days of searching through decades of accumulated records, Evelyn found a locked metal box in the church's basement storage, labeled simply IDF 1919. The church's current pastor had no memory of what the initials meant, but he authorized opening it. Inside were Ida's records, dozens of folders containing testimony, letters, photographs, and newspaper clippings. It was a complete archive of racial violence against black veterans, from November 1918 through some March. Marcus carefully examined the materials, his hands trembling at the importance of what they had found. Ida had documented 67 murders of black veterans in 8 months. Lynchings, beatings, shootings, murders that had been reported very little or not at all in mainstream press, that had been dismissed by authorities, and that had been systematically ignored. Each case had a folder with the victim's name, military service details, circumstances of death, and when possible, witness testimony and photographs. Ida had traveled to multiple states, corresponded with dozens of families, and created an evidence base that was powerful in its thoroughness. There were photographs, some taken by Ida herself, others provided by families, showing murdered men's bodies, their uniforms, their families in mourning. There were letters from mothers, wives, and siblings, describing in heartbreaking detail how their loved ones had been killed. There were newspaper clippings from black newspapers that had reported these deaths, alongside white newspaper clippings that either ignored them or blamed the victims. "This is one of the most important archives of racial violence I have ever seen," Angela said quietly. Ida created a historical record that otherwise would not exist. She ensured these men would not be forgotten. But there was more in the box. At the bottom, wrapped in cloth, was a diary, Ida's personal record of her work. The final entries were from July 1919, just weeks before her death. July 15, 1919. Received another threatening letter today. They say I will stop, or be stopped. Pastor suggests I leave Chicago, go to New York or Canada, where I might be safer. But I cannot stop. Every day brings news of another soldier murdered. If I don't document these crimes, who will? July 23, 1919. Followed again today by 2 white men. I recognized one from the mob photographs from the Chicago riot. They are watching me. I have prepared copies of my documentation and will distribute them to trusted people. If something happens to me, the work must continue. July 28, 1919. I am afraid, but I think of the mothers who gave their sons to this country's war, only to have them murdered when they returned. I think of the soldiers who believed their service would earn them citizenship, only to be lynched in their uniforms. Fear is small compared to their loss. I will continue. That was the last entry. 2 weeks later, Ida was found dead in an alley. Marcus looked at the archives spread before them. Ida's life work, her courage, her determination to ensure that black veterans' murders were documented and remembered. She had created this knowing it might cost her life, and it had. Marcus, Evelyn, and Angela began investigating Ida's death more thoroughly, knowing now that she had been threatened repeatedly and that her death had been dismissed without real proof. Investigation. They needed to understand what had happened and why authorities had ignored it. They found the police file was thin and dismissive. Ida's body had been discovered on August 12, 1919, in an alley near 35th Street, an area of Chicago's Black Belt. The initial report noted signs of violence but provided no details. No autopsy was conducted. No witnesses were interviewed. The case was closed within days, as cause undetermined. But Marcus found something else in researching Chicago newspapers from August 1919. The city had just experienced a devastating race riot from July 27th to August 3rd. White mobs had attacked black neighborhoods. Black residents had defended themselves, and the violence had left 38 dead and hundreds injured, with black communities bearing the brunt of the destruction. In the aftermath of that violence, with the city tense and authorities eager to restore order, a black woman's death was apparently considered unimportant, not worthy of investigation, especially if that investigation might reveal inconvenient truths about who had killed her and why. Evelyn found a reference in a black newspaper, the Chicago Whip, from August 16, 1919. A brief mention Miss Ida Freeman, known for her work documenting violence against our veterans, was found deceased this week. Community members suspect foul play, but police have declined to investigate. Miss Freeman had received threats due to her truth-telling work. It was a small notice, easily overlooked, but it confirmed what the historians suspected. Ida's community had known her work and had recognized her death as murder, even if authorities refused to acknowledge it. Angela tracked down descendants of people who had been in Ida's circle at Olivet Baptist Church. An elderly woman named Grace, whose grandmother had known Ida, shared a family story. My grandmother said Ida was killed because she would not be quiet about what was happening to former soldiers. She said white men killed her, and the police did not care because she was black, and because her sister Burke embarrassed people who wanted to pretend everything was fine. Marcus found one more piece of evidence, a letter in the personal papers of a defender, with journalist written in September 1919, that had never been published. The letter from someone identified only as a concerned citizen stated, "The murder of Ida Freeman was an assassination, pure and simple. She documented crimes that powerful people wanted forgotten. She was warned to stop. When she refused, she was killed. The police know who did it. White men connected to supremacist organizations but will not act. This is what happens when we tell truth to power." The pattern was clear. Ida had documented racial terrorism. She had compiled evidence that contradicted official stories of black people as the aggressors in racial violence. She had shown systematically that black veterans were being murdered for asserting their humanity. Her work was dangerous to those invested in maintaining white supremacy and in avoiding accountability for racial violence. So she had been murdered, and her murder had been deliberately ignored by authorities who saw her activism as the problem, rather than the violence she documented. She was silenced, Angela said, and then her work was buried. If that church had not preserved her archive, all of this would have been lost. Marcus thought about the photograph. Ida standing in shadow holding her sign, documenting even at a moment of celebration that black veterans were being murdered. She had known the risk. She had done the work anyway, and she had paid the ultimate price. The historians faced a profound responsibility. They had discovered Ida's archive, documented her murder, and now needed to decide how to honor her work and tell her story. This was not just historical research. It was about making sure that Ida's courage and the veterans she documented were not forgotten again. Marcus proposed a major exhibition at the Chicago History Museum centered on Ida's archive and the broader context of violence against black veterans in 1919. The exhibition would display the photograph, the enhanced images showing Ida and her sign, selections from her documentation of the 67 murdered veterans, and the story of her assassination. But before moving forward, they wanted to involve descendants of the murdered veterans Ida had documented. If those families still existed and still carried memories and pain from those losses, they deserved to participate in how this history was presented. Angela took on the careful work of tracing descendants, using Ida's meticulous records, which included family members' names and locations. She began reaching out through genealogical databases, church records, and community organizations in the states where the murders had occurred. The responses were powerful. Many families still carried stories of great-grandfathers or great-great-uncles who had gone to war, come home, and then disappeared, or been killed under suspicious circumstances. But they had never had official documentation. They had never had their loved ones' military service connected to their murders. They had never had validation that these were not just family tragedies, but part of a systematic campaign of terror. One descendant, Thomas, whose great-grandfather had been lynched in Georgia in 1919, wrote, "My family has told the story for generations, but we never had proof. White people in our town always said my great-grandfather must have done something to provoke what happened. Now you are telling me there is documentation, photographs, evidence that he was murdered simply for wearing his uniform. That changes everything." Another family, descendants of a soldier murdered in Mississippi, had been told their ancestor died in an accident. Only through Ida's records did they learn the truth. He had been beaten to death by a white mob after trying to vote. Marcus organized a gathering in Chicago, bringing together descendants of murdered veterans, historians, and community members. Over 30 families attended, representing soldiers from 8 states, all killed in the months after the war's end. The families shared their stories, their pain, their anger at how long the truth had been hidden, and they expressed deep thanks that Ida had documented their ancestors' deaths, ensuring that history could not erase them. "She was a stranger to my great-grandfather," one woman said, "but she cared enough to record his story, to interview his widow, to preserve his photograph. She did work his own government would not do. She gave us proof of what happened." The exhibition was planned for February 2025, timed to coincide with the 106th anniversary of the photograph. It would be called Standing in the Shadows, Ida Freeman and the Documented Terror Against Black Veterans. The centerpiece would be the 1919 photograph, displayed both in its original published form, where Ida was invisible, and in the enhanced version, showing her clearly with her sign. Visitors would see what had been hidden for over a century. They would understand how Ida had positioned herself to be documented, even as she remained unseen by most of the celebration. Ida's archive would be digitized and made accessible to researchers, ensuring that the 67 veterans she documented would be remembered by name. Their service would be honored, their murders acknowledged, and Ida herself would finally receive recognition, not just as a victim of violence, but as a documentarian, an activist, a woman who had risked and ultimately given her life to ensure that truth was not erased. The exhibition opened on February 17, 2025, exactly 106 years after the photograph was taken. The Chicago History Museum was filled beyond capacity. Descendants of murdered veterans, historians, activists, community members, and journalists from across the country attended. The exhibition space was designed to take visitors on a journey. It began with the original 1919 photograph as it appeared in the Chicago Defender. The celebration, the proud soldiers, the joyful community. Visitors saw what readers in 1919 had seen, a moment of hope and recognition. Then the enhanced version appeared on an adjacent wall, twice the size, with Ida now visible in the doorway and her sign readable. The revelation was powerful. What had seemed like simple celebration was revealed to contain witness to ongoing terror. The next section presented Ida's life, her migration from Mississippi, her work in Chicago, her growing commitment to documenting racial violence. Visitors saw her handwriting in letters, her careful records, and her courage in the face of threats. Then came the heart of the exhibition, Ida's documentation of the 67 murdered veterans. Each man had a small display with a photograph when available, military service record, circumstances of death, and family testimony when Ida had collected it. The total effect was devastating. 67 individual tragedies, 67 instances of racial terrorism, 67 murders that had been ignored or dismissed. Wall text explained the context, the Red Summer of 1919, the systematic violence against black communities, the specific targeting of veterans who challenged Jim Crow's racial order by their very existence as uniformed soldiers. The final section addressed Ida's murder, the threatening letters, the dismissive police response, the community's recognition of what had happened, and the century of silence that followed. A large panel asked visitors to consider how many other Ida Freemans existed. People who documented injustice, who told truth to power, who were silenced and then forgotten. The exhibition included contemporary connections to modern movements for racial justice, to ongoing work documenting police violence, and to the continued need to bear witness to systemic racism. Descendants of the murdered veterans attended the opening, many meeting each other for the first time and discovering shared history of loss and resistance. They stood before displays honoring their ancestors, some weeping, some filled with quiet pride that their loved ones were finally being recognized. Thomas, whose great-grandfather had been lynched in Georgia, spoke during the opening program. "For 106 years, my family carried this story alone. We were told it did not matter, that it was just something that happened to black people, and we should forget it. But Ida Freeman said it mattered. She documented it. She preserved my great-grandfather's name and his story. And now, finally, the world is listening." Media coverage was extensive. The story resonated. A forgotten photograph, a hidden figure finally revealed, An archive of resistance recovered. A woman who had given her life to document injustice. News outlets around the world ran features about Ida and the veterans she had honored through her work. But perhaps most significantly, the exhibition sparked conversations about what else remained hidden in historical photographs, in archives, and in the shadows. How many other acts of resistance had been documented, but not seen? How many other people had stood witness to injustice, only to be erased from memory? The museum created a digital archive of Ida's work, making it accessible to researchers, students, and family members searching for information about ancestors. Within weeks, additional connections were made. More descendants were found, more stories were recovered, and more evidence of the systematic violence that Black veterans faced in 1919 came to light. Ida's work, preserved in that church basement for over a century, was finally reaching the audience she had intended. Future generations who needed to understand what had been done, who had resisted, and what courage looked like in the face of terror. 6 months after the exhibition opened, its impact continued to spread. Descendants of the 67 murdered veterans Ida had documented formed an organization dedicated to preserving their ancestors' memories and advocating for historical markers at the sites where they were killed. Several state historical commissions agreed to install commemorative markers, officially acknowledging murders that had been ignored for over a century. In Georgia, a marker was placed near where one veteran had been lynched. It read, "Corporal William Anderson, U.S. Army, lynched August 1919 for wearing his military uniform." His murder was documented by Ida Freeman, whose own assassination for her truth-telling work exemplifies the costs of resistance to racial terror. Marcus worked with the Smithsonian to include portions of Ida's archive in the National Museum of African American History and Culture, ensuring permanent national recognition of her work. The museum created an exhibition section on Black women documentarians who had risked their lives to preserve evidence of racial violence. Ida featured prominently alongside better-known figures like Ida B. Wells. Evelyn and Angela co-authored a comprehensive book about Ida, life and work, titled Standing in the Shadows, Ida Freeman's Archive of Resistance. The book included reproductions of Ida's documentation, analysis of the systematic violence against Black veterans in 1919, and reflections on how historical erasure operates and can be challenged. The book sparked renewed interest in other hidden figures in the fight against racial violence. People who had done crucial work but had been forgotten or deliberately erased from history. Researchers across the country began searching archives more carefully, using enhanced imaging technology on old photographs and looking for evidence of resistance that had been invisible for generations. A graduate student in North Carolina found another photograph from 1919 that, when enhanced, showed a Black woman in the background holding a similar protest sign during a different celebration. Investigation revealed she had been part of a network of women documentarians, working independently but toward the same goal, preserving evidence of racial terrorism. The discovery suggested that Ida had not been alone, that there had been others doing similar work, creating a distributed archive of resistance that historians were only now beginning to uncover. Thomas and other descendants pushed for Ida's murder to be officially reopened as a cold case, arguing that even after a century, acknowledgement of what had been done mattered. The Chicago Police Department initially resisted, but public pressure and media attention eventually led to an official statement acknowledging that Ida Freeman's death in 1919 had not been properly investigated, and that available evidence suggested she had been murdered in retaliation for her activism. It was not prosecution. The perpetrators were long dead, but it was official acknowledgement, and that mattered to Ida's memory and to the families who had been told for generations that their suspicions of murder were unfounded. Race, the elderly woman whose grandmother had known Ida, attended a memorial service at Olivet Baptist Church, where Ida's archive had been preserved. She spoke about generational memory, about how her grandmother had told her to remember Ida's name, to remember that Black women had fought back, had documented injustice, and had refused to be silent, even when silence would have kept them safer. "My grandmother said that someday people would understand what Ida did," Grace said. She said the truth always finds a way to surface, even if it takes 100 years. She was right. The original photograph was now displayed permanently at the Chicago History Museum with interactive technology, allowing visitors to zoom in and see Ida clearly. Children on school field trips stood before it, learning about hidden history, about how resistance sometimes operates in shadows, and about the courage required to document truth when powerful forces want it buried. Marcus often stood in the exhibition, watching visitors encounter Ida's story. He thought about that February afternoon in 2024, when he had first zoomed in on what seemed like an ordinary photograph, revealing the extraordinary. He thought about how close Ida's work had come to being lost forever, preserved only because a church had kept a locked box in its basement for over a century. And he thought about how many other stories remained hidden, waiting for someone to look closely enough to enhance the image, to zoom in on the shadows where resistance had been operating all along. Ida's story was recovered now. Her courage was recognized. Her work was preserved. But she stood for countless others whose documentation of injustice, whose acts of resistance, and whose sacrifices remained invisible. The photograph that had gone unnoticed for 100 years was now one of the most viewed images in the Tall Museum's collection. And Ida Freeman, who had stood in shadow holding a sign about murdered veterans, who had documented 67 deaths before her own assassination, who had been erased from history for over a century, was finally seen. Her sign in that doorway had declared, "They served. They returned. They were murdered."